Hello and welcome back to the MMA Bar. Today, we're going to discuss the two most renowned MMA organizations in history, the differences in how they operated, some eye-opening facts, and a discussion of which is better. Pride Fighting Championship was a mixed martial arts promotion that originated in Japan in 1997. Also called Pride FC or simply Pride, Pride Fighting Championship was easily the biggest MMA promotion in the world in the early 2000s. Some people who had been MMA fans since the Pride FC days might even argue that it is the best MMA promotion ever, even better than the UFC. Pride FC is considered to be the golden age of MMA. Founded in 1993 in the US, the UFC is the pioneer of modern MMA in the Western world. Pride FC, on the other side, emerged a few years later in 1997 in Japan. While the UFC may have burst onto the scene several years before Pride Fighting Championships, there can be little doubting that the US-based promotion was struggling in the late 1990s. On the other hand, Pride and Japanese MMA were going from strength to strength. During the early 2000s, the UFC was going through a lot of changes. In 2000, the famous Fertitta brothers and Dana White bought the UFC for $2 million and they focused on regulating the sport. We saw the birth of unified rules of MMA. That changed the sport for the better, new pay-per-view deals, and many other changes. At the time, their goal was to build a strong base and strategy that would allow them to rise in the following years. At the same time, Pride FC was rising at a rapid rate and was more popular than the UFC. It was the home of the best fighters in the world and the toughest competition. Many UFC fighters moved over to fight in Pride during the early 2000s, out of which some were UFC legends like Don Fry, Mark Coleman, and Royce Gracie. Both UFC and Pride FC are two companies that, apart from promoting the same sport, do not have much else in common. If we set them against one another, these two differ a lot when it comes to rules, even format, and many other things. Here is all you need to know about the differences between UFC and Pride. Some of the best fights of all time took place in Pride, and that's because many of the greatest competitors fought there. Fedor Emelianenko, Wanderlei Silva, Mirko Cro Cop, and Kenton Rampage Jackson became megastars in Pride. This is one of the reasons Pride was different. Since no one was scared of taking on the other, Pride featured lots of open weight bouts. Open weight bouts are something quite not common in the UFC. While in Pride, Wanderlei Silva was at a 70-pound weight disadvantage when he fought against Mark Hunt on short notice. In the UFC, people have been clamoring for Jon Jones to come back and take on Francis Ngannou for so long. Another major difference was the rules. In its early years, the UFC came under increased pressure and censorship by lawmakers in the US who deemed the sport too violent. However, on the other side of the globe, the Pride Fighting Championships had its own very particular set of rules which very much set it apart from its competition, both in terms of sheer brutality and violence. The UFC played a big role in creating the unified rules of MMA, which they adopted in 2000. Pride FC never adopted this set of rules since they had their own rules that were much different in many areas. There were some defining differences in rules between the UFC and Pride FC. In Pride, the major ones are soccer kicks, stomps, and knees to the head of a downed opponent. While the UFC allowed elbows to the face, it was banned in Pride FC. The difference in rules between the two organizations determined how the fight was and how the fights often played out. It was this exact ultraviolence being performed in a controlled environment by some of the most talented and baddest men on the planet that made Pride a huge hardcore fan favorite. So, while the UFC continued to flounder and struggle to find its feet, Pride continued to go from strength to strength. As wrestling is such a large part of US sporting culture, the UFC rules are generally recognized as catering more to wrestlers. While the rules set in Pride ensured there was less groundwork with more action on the feet, which is what I believe contributed to many of Pride's epic battles. The core differences and what separated UFC from Pride were its fouls. As some of what was considered an illegal move in the UFC was legitimate in Pride. It was these differences that foremost gave Pride the well-earned title of most brutal MMA promotion. Moves like spiking or pile driving of your opponent, kneeing to the head of a grounded opponent, and stomping of a grounded fighter were banned in the UFC but allowed in Pride. I think it's fair to say that it was the combination of pure theater, brutality, and rules that were borderline attempted murder combined to make Pride FC the most reviled yet revered of the MMA promotions. However, both organizations agree that there are no hits to the back of the head or the spine area. And believe it or not, both organizations have the best interests of their fighters at heart. For many years, the owners of the UFC saw Pride as a direct threat to their dominance in the sport. And in subsequent years, when UFC and Pride fighters crossed paths, it was by far the Pride FC fighters who came out on top. When you compare, the Pride fighters that went to the UFC amassed a combined record of 30-25 and UFC fighters going to Pride with records of 34-36. It would appear that Pride fighters fighting in the UFC are better than UFC fighters fighting in Pride. Pride fighters like Anderson Silva, Rampage Jackson, and Antonio Nogueira went to be champs in the UFC. In 2003, Dana White brought over Chuck the Iceman Liddell to compete in the Pride FC Middleweight Grand Prix. Dana's plan was for Liddell to make it to the finals and defeat Wanderlei Silva. Unfortunately for Dana White, Kenton Rampage Jackson knocked out Chuck Liddell in the semifinals. Many people felt that Liddell's loss was a clear indicator that the UFC's talent wasn't as skilled as the Pride FC fighters. Another difference between Pride and the UFC was where the fights happened. While the UFC uses its world-famous trademark octagon cage designed specifically for MMA, Pride used the more traditional boxing ring. The octagon cage used by the UFC was designed specifically for MMA. Well, it was designed firstly for visual impact and secondly for MMA, as some of the original designs included a moat filled with crocodiles as well as razor wire surrounding the top of the cage. Many believe the decision to use the cage led to some of the early opposition to the sport. Men fighting in a cage, like animals, was something sure to get the adrenaline pumping. Regardless, this shape and style of design have gone on to affect how the fights play out. As there is a solid wall at the sides, UFC fighters can use this to get back to their feet, some better than others. But fighters can also use the cage side as a tool, stopping themselves from being submitted and even as a surface to jump against when launching an attack. Also, Pride used to have tournaments from time to time. Pride FC had championships in each weight class. Still, their Grand Prix tournaments were the most popular MMA events in the world at the time. We saw the best fighters competing multiple times in a single night, which was crazy to watch. UFC also had tournaments in the early 90s, but they abandoned the concept after just a couple of years. In addition to money prize, a championship belt was given to the winner of each tournament, though this belt only denoted the tournament winner and would never be defended. Perhaps the biggest difference between Pride and the UFC is the drug testing policy. According to most MMA experts, Pride FC did not have the strictest drug testing policy. With that being said, at least the Pride FC fighters were on an even playing field. Although in the UFC, the USADA system of drug system is adopted. Regardless, some fighters are juicing and others are not. Pride FC's discretion on steroids allowed fighters to have superhuman levels of energy and power. Just take a look at Wanderlei Silva's physique in 2006 compared to today. He was a monster, and he was also one of the best fighters in the world. Of course, steroids alone did not make Wanderlei the legend that he is, but they did play a part in his success. But again, everyone in Pride FC was allowed to take steroids without getting in trouble. According to Enson Inoue, the officials at Pride FC actually encouraged their fighters to take steroids. Enson also revealed other Pride FC secrets when he was a guest on the Joe Rogan podcast. Another thing that made Pride FC different from the UFC was the 10-minute first round. Today, every round in the UFC is 5 minutes long. The Pride 10-minute first round was great for a number of different reasons. First and foremost, grapplers were given much more time to work with. 10 minutes on the ground probably seemed like an eternity for someone who was stuck in a bad position against a skilled wrestler or jiu-jitsu practitioner. A 10-minute first round also forced competitors to take their training extremely serious. Even UFC commentator Joe Rogan agrees that the 10-minute first round was awesome. Unfortunately, Dana White does not. During a UFC press conference, White was asked if he would ever consider utilizing a 10-minute first round. Of course, Dana White said that he wouldn't change anything about the UFC's current model. But what resulted in the fall of Pride and how did they go out of business? Pride FC was one of those companies that went from top to bottom in a very short time. And the exact cause of its fall is still unknown. It all started when the company lost its biggest TV deal with Fuji TV in 2006, which had a huge impact on its revenue. At the time, their main incomes were through various TV deals, and Fuji was the main one. The impact was so bad that Pride got out of business in less than a year, and it all ended with UFC buying Pride in 2007. Zuffa, the parent body of the UFC, acquired Pride for $70 million. The main question is, why did Fuji TV decide to get out of business with the most successful MMA company? According to many sources, this has a lot to do with the internal issues within Pride, people who ran it, or better to say, controlled it. Around 2005, rumors were flying that Pride was under the control of the Japanese mafia group called Yakuza. This group used Pride to fix matches, manipulate the taxes, gamble, and do other illegal stuff. And like that wasn't bad enough, many sources suggest that there was an internal war between two Yakuza groups over their interest in the promotion. All of this had a huge impact on Pride FC as a brand and what it stood for, notably when it comes to its fans in Japan. Japanese people were appalled by groups like Yakuza or anything this group was involved in at the time. So when it became clear that they were involved in Pride, the image and TV ratings have fallen. It's a shame that all the reasons behind its fall do not have anything to do with the sport and production itself. Pride events will forever be once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. Going by these comparisons, it would appear as though Pride is the better and more entertaining organization. But one has to question whether the UFC's conservative approach is what has made them survive and thrive where Pride hasn't. This is why the Pride versus UFC debate is pointless. Thank you for watching this video. That's all for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell.